Our next presenter is attorney Moira Meltzer-Cohen. Attorney Meltzer-Cohen is an educator and abolitionist, serving overlapping communities of activists, queers, and prisoners. Their work includes criminal defense, particularly for those arrested in the course of justice struggles, representation of witnesses before federal grand juries, and advocacy for those seeking gender affirming and other necessary but often withheld care while in prison. Their practice also includes drafting agency and estate documents, quality of life planning for individuals and families of all kinds, including queer and polyamorous families. Attorney Meltzer-Cohen has represented political prisoners such as Chelsea Manning, Leonard Peltier, and many others. Attorney Meltzer-Cohen is also a professor at CUNY School of Law. And so with great pleasure, I hand it over to Attorney Meltzer-Cohen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone who organized this. It's really, I'm really enjoying hearing from everyone else. So I'm Moira Meltzer-Cohen. Everyone calls me Mo. I have been defending protesters, water protectors, prisoners, including queer, elderly, and political prisoners, grand jury resistors, and other type of rabble-rousers since about 2012, including with co-counseling with a number of the people on this panel. It's really nice to see you all. So I guess, Dawn, I have some slides. If you can share your screen, I'd like to thank you. Are you able to make a slideshow view? Okay, I think if you go all the way up and go to the middle of the screen, it'll say slideshow. Perfect. Thank you so much, Dawn. So this is what I have to say about the ethics of defending protests and protesters and politically motivated prosecutions. So what we usually see is that cops will use mass arrest as a form of crowd control, and then they rationalize those arrests with typically, but not always, low-level charges. The other thing that can happen is that something that's completely normal garden variety protest behavior or action or belief gets manufactured into some kind of unbelievably intense politically motivated prosecution, which is, of course, what we are seeing in Atlanta right now with the RICO cases. So all the cases that stem from mass arrests or politically motivated action, and note, again, these may be different things, right? Politically motivated action or politically motivated prosecution may be different things, may have some special characteristics, but also in many ways, they're just criminal cases. One thing I did want to note before I go farther is that both Javi and Attorney Cannon were really clear about the value of mass defense committees and client-centeredness. And one of the things that I want to stress is that, you know, as much as I enjoy the practice of law, I think we need to acknowledge that the law is not always the best and is sometimes the worst mechanism for liberation. And so I want to read to you from my own sacred text, which is the representation of witnesses before federal grand juries, a word about defense and support committees. And this goes way back, and it says, grand jury proceedings are anomalies in the legal system. They operate too swiftly and in secret, and according to few of the rules familiar to either trained lawyers or the lay public. This is one area of the law in which strictly legal victories are indeed rare. And it says, attorneys who have represented witnesses in the context of grand juries investigating political activists or political communities have found grand jury defense and support committees extremely valuable. Grand jury cases are often won or lost on the strength of community support for witnesses rather than the excellence of argument or even the legal merit of the attorney's position. Of course, defense committees do not always save a witness from jail, but they can accomplish a number of things that lawyers cannot accomplish. Judges are noticeably more reluctant to jail witnesses before a courtroom crowded with spectators, family members, and press. Moreover, supporters reduce a witness's sense of isolation and provide that much needed assistance, which can enable a witness to remain strong throughout court appearances and in some cases, many months in jail. And I know that that is specifically targeted to the context of federal grand juries, but it is absolutely the case that the support committee accomplishes all of those things for any politically motivated prosecution. And Dawn, if you can go back up to the top of the slides, I think we're running through the slides more quickly than I had planned. Okay, so what is special about defending protesters or defending dissidents? In a real way, defending dissidents is defending the continued possibility of dissidents and defending the possibility of the more just society that our clients want to build. And to the extent that our clients are aware of this, they're often willing to sacrifice their own legal interests to the interests of their communities, movements, and values, or at least to do things that at first blush appear to criminal defense attorneys not to be in our clients' best interests. But as Attorney Cannon pointed out, although we are often taught to define those interests strictly in terms of the law, that is not, in fact, our job. So I want to talk about the ethical considerations that I think militate in favor of kind of reframing our role as attorneys, along with some of the legal strategies and tools at our and our clients' disposal. And I'm going to focus on two of the rules of professional conduct, which are ABA Rule 1.2 on the goals of representation and ABA Rule 1.7, which deals with conflict and conflict waivers. And Dawn, if you can go back up to, I think, slide 3. Okay, great. So obviously, the defense strategy for every case typically involves minimizing exposure to criminal liability. And the representation of protesters or dissidents, whether we're talking about a mass arrest or a manufactured federal prosecution, is obviously no different than any other case in that the lawyer's obligation is to minimize that exposure and also pursue the client's stated objectives. However, all of the defense strategy, as Attorney Cannon very aptly said, needs to be led by the client and their cohort, and they may be a little more likely than some other clients to be really assertive about being active participants in their own defense, which is great. But one thing to consider is, in what might be a new way for some of us, is the need to recognize that the legal goals of the client may be more focused on accomplishing movement goals than on minimizing negative legal outcome for themselves. So Dawn, if you can go to the next slide. So the ABA Rule 1.2 is very clear that subjects to the preceding paragraphs, a lawyer shall abide by a client's decisions concerning the objectives of representation and shall consult with the client as to the means by which those objectives are to be pursued. And so if we are aware that our client's objectives may not include legal self-preservation, that may change the way we approach defense. But your client is the one with the rights at stake, and our client is therefore the one who gets to define those objectives. And assuming they're not unlawful, our job is to diligently pursue those objectives using every lawful means at our disposal. Next slide. So I really see our job as to primarily be listening, right? I think that being an attorney, especially a litigator, is a very public-facing, talky profession. But the fact is, I think more of our job has to do with listening patiently, and it may really require patience. And obviously, I think we actually have this obligation with all clients, but it may manifest a little differently with protest cases or political cases. particularly where we're looking at a mass arrest where a lot of the cases might feel really low stakes and really simple. Like, you don't need a ton of information here. You know, you're going to go into court, you're going to get out of court, it's going to be a dismissal, or it's going to, you know how this is going to be resolved, easy peasy, done. You may not necessarily go into this prepared to spend a couple of hours listening to the client's story, but I think it can be really important for several reasons beyond just information gathering. So first, for purposes of building real and meaningful trust, our law degree does not magically confer upon us integrity or trustworthiness. And I would say a healthy dose of humility can really help with that. My favorite things to say to clients are things like, tell me more. And that's a really good question. Let's find out the answer together. Because I think making clear to your client that you are not all-knowing is very affirming for them. Being very clear about what it is in your power to do and the limits of your power and other kinds of constraints that you may be operating under, I think is really important. And the other thing is that while we should be very cautious and circumspect about the fact that we are neither qualified nor authorized by our law degree to act as therapists, there is a reason that we're called counselor. Trauma is real, and it can just be really helpful for a client to hear you say, that sounds really stressful, I'm so sorry that happened. And the information that they're conveying to you might be totally extraneous, and it might be really critical to their defense, but we won't know until we let them tell us. And since stress and mistrust diminish cognitive capacity, helping your clients feel heard and comfortable with you can actually materially help them to engage more meaningfully and more deliberately with their own defense as a partner with you. So, again, be really clear with expectations. Don't overpromise, don't underperform, make it really clear what your lane is and stay in that lane. So, I would just say I propose reframing our role as one that casts us less as an authority and more as a resource. I would say ideally our job is to answer questions and offer resources and not necessarily to dictate solutions. And I think that our more authoritarian impulses are really cultivated throughout law school and throughout this profession generally. But people really are experts on their own lives. People have robust understandings of their own experiences, their own cultures, their own guiding principles. And our expertise can be really useful, but not determinative. So, I see my job as being to advise people of the possible or likely consequences of different courses of action, to exercise my own clinical judgment and advise them on the course of action that I understand to be the least legally risky, and to be absolutely explicit that that is what I'm doing, right? To say, this is legal advice. Your political goals may be inconsistent with my legal advice, right? And to really understand our clients are the captains of their own ships. It doesn't mean that we have to be a yes man. It doesn't mean that we can't communicate to the client about the ways in which their behavior is likely to undermine their own goals or our ability to effectively do our job. But it does mean that we have to respect their self-determination and their right to make decisions that we might not make for them. And not only is there not a professional ethical problem with this, there is actually a professional requirement that we be able to represent our clients in a way that honors their autonomy. So that doesn't mean that you personally are obligated to represent every client. If you have a personal ethical problem with whatever it is that they're doing, if you're allowed to withdraw, transfer your client to someone who does not share your qualms about representing them in the way that they want to be represented. But, be a whole person and be honest about your capacity and your own ethical commitments. So next slide. What I always say to my clients is, I have an obligation to offer you the best possible legal advice based on my education, experience, expertise, and judgment, and you have no obligation to follow that advice. And that is something that I live by. One of the first things I always tell my clients is you have a lot of rights in this relationship, and one of the rights you have is to fire me. So next slide. Dawn, can you go to the next slide? Okay, I'm going to continue. Thank you. So some of the client objectives that might show up in these cases that we maybe haven't encountered before, I would say the big one is controlling the narrative both in and out of court, because charging protesters or charging dissidents criminally criminalizes the act of protest or criminalizes the message that they are espousing. Clients may be committed to refocusing on that message at any cost or at greater cost than might seem to you as their lawyer strictly necessary. And that's okay. You can use your representation to help them to refocus on that message. I know that Sandy can speak compellingly to all the different ways in which litigation can help to refocus on the message and to expose things like government misconduct. And I hope that Sandy will talk about that later. Next message. Or next slide, I mean. We've already talked a little bit about support committees. Non-lawyer legal workers can be extremely valuable. Having people who are providing social support can be extremely valuable. Often clients want a media strategy. Often clients want to use their case and the prosecution as a mechanism for public education, both about the relevant movement and the criminalization of that movement, or the criminalization more generally of social movements. You can really tie your defense strategy to the substance of the protest. The other thing that you can do is dispose of the charges as quickly as possible in a manner that will not interfere with people's ability to continue to mobilize. Focus entirely on media and education and organizing by just getting that case entirely out of the way. And that's another really legitimate way to dispose of a case while refocusing on the message. So a note on media, a lot of times, as we know, anything that a client says publicly can and will be used against them. If your client wants to do media, even if you think it's so risky, I think in the interest of harm reduction, make sure they know you're available to them to both explain those risks and to review any statements that they want to make. Talk to your clients about doxing and protecting themselves against doxing. That is super important, especially right now. Remind them that anything they say publicly can and will be used against them, and consider working closely with that support committee to draft and review statements from the support committee so that the narrative that is being developed isn't attributable directly to your client. And finally, prevail upon your clients to be very circumspect about posting video online. It is a losing battle. It is still a battle worth fighting. One of the reasons I think it can be really important to present access to the media as an option for people who are being criminally charged in the course of struggles for justice is that they really want to have their voices heard. And the legal system is not the only venue to have your voice heard, it's probably the worst venue for having their voice widely heard. So if your clients are feeling like the only way they can be heard is by going to trial, and a trial is not actually going to serve them, talking to them about having a media or public education campaign might be a really good way to shield them from exposure to legal liability while also helping them to tell their story. The last thing that I want to say is that if you are going to head toward trial, I highly, highly recommend engaging in a joint defense agreement. This is an agreement that is grounded in the common interest privilege, and you need to look at the ethical rule 1.7 about conflict and the waiver of conflict. And I would like to say, I know that there have been a lot of concerns voiced about the idea of having a joint defense agreement because we are so educated to believe that it's our obligation to protect our one single client by any means necessary. But we know that joint defense agreements are not simply a mechanism for movement solidarity or protecting movement leaders or movement goals. They are legally effective. So that's it. That's all I got for you.
Thank you, Attorney Meltzer-Cohen, and for emphasizing self-determination and how to augment that in the attorney-client relationship. That is so important. It's a skill that one often must learn following law school if you're lucky enough, perhaps to get it in a movement clinic while you're in law school. So your students are very, very fortunate to have you. Our next speaker is Sandra Freeman, who is an attorney, counselor, abolitionist, dedicated to defense of the earth and of all peoples impacted by the corruption and human rights violation inherent in borders, policing, and extractive industry. A zealous trial lawyer, Sandra is a graduate of the National Criminal Defense College and has tried cases to judges and juries in courts across Turtle Island. Sandra specializes in trauma-informed representation of Black, Brown, and Indigenous LGBTQ2S+ clients, investigated, imprisoned, sued, and targeted for acts of sovereignty, protest, and political activism. In 2016 to 2017, Sandra helped the Water Protector Legal Collective to coordinate the criminal defense of hundreds of water protectors arrested during the historic No Dakota Access Pipeline movement. As an anti-racist facilitator and educator, Sandra supports community-based legal initiatives, healing, justice for movements seeking collective liberation. Sandra graduated with a BS from Louisiana State University and earned a law degree from the American University Washington College of Law. Sandra is a member of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, the Virginia Mountain Valley Lawyers Association, the Colorado LGBTQ Bar Association, and the Federal Faculty of Advocates and National Lawyers Guild. Sandra is a member of the steering committee for the NLG's Mass Defense Committee. Sandra represents political prisoners such as Eric King and has represented Chelsea Manning, Leonard Peltier, and many others. Thank you for being with us, Attorney Freeman. I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, good morning, good day. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, everyone. I just want to give a disclaimer. I'm in a rural area with some sketchy internet. So if I hop out on you, then I think that's just the way that maybe I'll wrap my time quickly. I'm going to share a screen, and it's a real honor to be with you all today. I'm going to talk about what I'm calling relational ethics for transformational lawyering. Before we start, I just want to take a deep breath. I'm nervous and kind of shy. And also ask everybody, I know this is weird, but put your hand on your heart and to hum a couple times. And the first one, I'm gonna ask you to hum to the earth, to the creator, to her slow, groovy movement that's gonna persist contrary to all this exploitation and violence. Let's think about her and give her a hum. And on this day, I really want to give another one a hum of thanksgiving to your peoples, to all our peoples, our families, our crews, our barrios, everybody who made and make you and us possible. I want to greet you. I want to thank you, Jen, all the organizers, for this powerful conversation on Juneteenth. It's an incredible day for all of us to gather and to be making, putting our minds together and making noise with and for each other, for the land and our peoples. Thanks, Jen, for that introduction. My name is Sandra Freeman. Friends call me Sandy. I like to describe myself as an outlaw lawyer because I truly believe our solutions to creating another world are outside of and beyond the law. I'm mostly a defensive creature. I've been defending neighbors, family, water protectors, prisoners, dissidents, and federal, tribal, and state courts since 2009. I'm currently a staff attorney at the Water Protector Legal Collective. We're an Indigenous-led legal organization born out of a prayer at Standing Rock to protect the water, not just for original peoples and nations, but peoples of all future generations. Next slide. I'm so honored and excited to talk with you all today about how we can ground our practice of law in liberatory learning exchanges and movement building with people resisting domination and seeking alternatives to empire sustained by this racist neocolonial capitalism. You'll see some references to educational theory and scholarship here, and I have materials that I'll upload for folks afterwards. I'm using this and I really kind of go to these places because I think that our legal training often neglects to address how any legal court administrative process, especially criminalization, prosecution, and imprisonment, is a political flex of state power that can be powerfully, transformationally educational and radicalizing for all of us involved. If we have to distinguish between roles, between the lawyer and the client, and the movements, right, that are surrounding these actions that get pulled into the legal system. What I mean by transformationally educational and radicalizing is that if you are open to it, right, keeping an open heart and mind in doing this work has transformational power, not just through the repression, the surveillance, the struggle, right, the late nights, like the no sleep, the new relationships that you experience as lawyers and the people who will seek you out for your good heart, but like in the joy, the expansion of understanding and development of kinship that happens when we relate and listen to our clients and our communities, our peoples, not as a lawyer, but as a fellow human being in struggle. As alluded to by previous panelists, it's such an honor to be speaking with all of you today. The rules of ethics, allow and invite us to thoughtfully and ethically practice law in a way that welcomes participatory collective processes and exposes oppressive systems while we are seeking justice for our peoples. What this means, relational ethics, is finding support within the rules of professional conduct to emphasize collective meaning making and strategizing with our clients and community through other ways of seeing and knowing, not just law. Through listening. Thank you, Mo, for emphasizing. Thank you, Attorney Cannon, for emphasizing that client-centeredness, that listening space. Organizing, encouraging and building autonomy, right? And that sometimes often means outside of the courts. And value for other temporalities. I say other temporalities because we know that we have existed much longer than the United States empire, than these courts, than these rules of criminal procedure, civil procedure, get amended, changed to disadvantage us. How to value that. Law school certainly indoctrinates us into avoiding this type of transformational practice. Teaches us to be adversarial, competitive, self-perpetuating, right? Let's make a career. Let's continue this legal system. And the law, I think, is pretty anti-science and anti-learning. It's like, in what world are we like, this thing happened one time, And then we're all gonna, like, instead of repeating and like finding the truth of the thing, that's going to be the truth of how, I don't know. It's sort of weird to me. It teaches us to be a lawyer as an expert and gatekeeper, to treat our clients as jealously guarded property. And law school teaches us this fallacy of courtrooms as the creator and locus of justice. And so I think it's that, we must find and support each other as we seek to infuse the ethical rules with true ethics, a relational ethics based on who we are as human beings, meeting other human beings in the context of struggle, repression, and often persecution. And so I think some of the grounding principles are to remember always that these systems were made for domination and exploitation, not to work for or truly empower us. These systems are young. The earth and her peoples, we, the peoples, remember and keep in mind, like when it gets hard and they're trying to put contempt on you, step you back, keep in mind, we exist beyond them. I know we'll hear more about repression. We're always learning more about repression and the way that capitalist hydra changes forms. And law-trained attorneys, we're not immune from that repression, that surveillance, that marginalization. And to understand that, like, those are things that we will face when our presence and our accompaniment challenges the dominant narratives about how lawyers should act. And that to struggle alone is a way of drowning, right? We need each other. We gotta hold each other up. So relational ethics, rules of professional conduct, 1.1, competence, and humility. I heard a lot of the other panelists speak on humility, and I love sort of hearing that word, not as a humiliation, but lawyering with humility means knowing our job begins with and exists only because, like, our peoples have problems and need us, not just because we are as lawyers. I think lawyers approaching clients and cases with a genuine desire to learn from and understand what is happening can facilitate a much more effective relationship, right? That case satisfaction, even, if it turns out the case goes on for 10 years because your person is locked up, locked down, right? That competence and humility about, hey, these are the things I don't know, is a way to achieve satisfaction even in that struggle and repression. The client is absolutely an expert in their own life, their own struggle, and the ways that they are experiencing repression and criminalization. Their peoples are experts in what they have been experiencing. And often I find that these criminal cases, everything that has a front has a back. There are two sides. We're seeing this criminal case. What lies underneath is something that we can expose, or those machinations that they try to put in place. So AVA Model Rule 1.1, competence. Lawyers shall provide competent representation, requiring legal knowledge, skills, thoroughness, and preparation reasonably necessary. And I have here, there is, I think, one thing that's so important with competence is to say, I don't know. Like, we're trained to feel like we have to know all the answers, but the law is always shifting and we're always learning, especially about the law. We're always learning about our histories and about ourselves. And so honesty about our experience, knowledge, and skill set, I think is super important. I remember when Mo and I were in North Dakota, like lawyering out there on the prairie, and there are these missiles being put up around camp, and I was calling one of the elder lawyers and I'm like, what do we do? I'm like, I don't know what to do. And he said, well, I think you're doing great. And it's like, that's not helpful. Like, what? And I was asking him, like, well, what did you do? And he said, hey, that was a different situation than what you've got going on right now. Like, I'm not going to tell you I know what to do. And even as hard as that was to be like, oh, there's no easy answer, and it was really respectful. We told like, sometimes I don't know. So knowing our competencies, thinking about, when we're talking about revolutionary stuff, we're talking about aiming for a new world. And so there's maybe no way of knowing exactly where that's going to go or what that's going to look like. And so have here grassroots growing a new world. And when it's dark, and you're walking around in the dark, like the earth has your feet. Those grassroots are what are going to hold us when we're walking into maybe a place we really don't know. Competence and humility. Coming here to ABA Model Rule 1.2, 1.4, about defining the win. And I heard Attorney Edison, I really love that our advocacy must not be confined to the dictates of the law, right? The win, what we are reaching for is, and what our peoples are reaching for is often beyond the courtroom. I won't repeat what Attorney Meltzer-Cohen read to you. But what I will say is that what I mean by relational ethics is these rules can be read to either cement, emphasize lawyer hierarchy and power, and use that power to obstructively limit people's decisions to the only categories explicitly required by the rule for client input, being settlement, plea, waiver of jury, or testimony. Or we can read these rules as providing a baseline that really authorizes us and empowers us to respect client, to engage in joint meaning making and collaborative strategizing. So, I mean, an example is client asks you about motions or discovery processes, comes in talking about Brady or Giglio. Like, what does that mean? And I think that lawyers, when you're like, well, people can get defensive, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, I can do that, right? But there is a way to be curious and collaborative. Well, what do you mean? Where did you hear? Like, what are you thinking on this? Here's what I know Brady means. Here's what I know Giglio means. What are things you think might undermine the prosecutor's case? And people will tell you, their support crew will tell you stories of previous sort of repression, the surveillance, all of these pieces of things that that people know about that are beyond just the head of that indictment. And so how to be curious and collaborative in defining actually what it is that someone wants from a case. I have here a picture of my dear friend and colleague, Rattler, Matotanka, Mapia Luta, a descendant of the Red Cloud, a signatory of the 1868 Sioux Treaty, who I'm really proud to represent and to have stood by for a long time. Rattler and others were charged with civil disorder related to nonviolent resistance and protecting people from police brutality and law enforcement militarized violence on their unceded homelands. He was charged in federal court with civil disorder and use of fire and commission of a federal felony as a 10-year mandatory minimum. There were restrictions on how we could talk about the treaties, restrictions on how we could talk about the land, and Rattler decided to enter a non-cooperating plea to one single count of civil disorder. But there were things that needed to be said. And so we had a sentencing hearing. And we put on witnesses for a sentencing hearing. And it was a whole thing, even though it was a non-cooperating plea, there were things that needed to be said in that courtroom. And so we did. Had a full on, I mean, it felt like almost a capital sentencing hearing on this non-cooperating plea we're putting in front of the court. And Rattler was allowed to self-surrender to BOP. We also had a note from the court clerk thanking us. I mean, I never had seen such a thing, but thanking us for being there, for speaking and for letting the court know who we were and what was really happening here. And I think it is like those, I don't know, my co-counsel never talked to me again. He was so mad about like, he's like, this is unnecessary. I'm out. Never talked to me again after that. That's okay, right? Rattler people were heard and had a day in court. And so that is, right, we're changing when the objectives and strategy. Another rule here, I got conflicts. I don't know, these could be lightning bolts, they could be wings, right? Conflict is so difficult and we're trained to be so adversarial, but like conflict and the breaking of something is also, I think, the breaking of the shell of our understanding, right? I think white supremacy culture is one of silence, hierarchy, and avoidance of conflict, except for when we're like trained to go in and do our technical thing. But like struggle requires conflict. And courtrooms require conflict in different kinds of ways. So I think acknowledging, right, that we are professionally trained to be adversarial in a certain kind of way, but there's generative conflict waiting for us, and things that we can, those conversations we can have. I will include like a sample conflict waiver for the requirements set out by Rule 1.7b. I'm not really going to concentrate on like that client conflict of interest, like one client against another. I think it's really like, what does your, how to engage in that and go through those requirements with the client. But something I really want to ask people to consider here is, Rule 1.7a2 discusses conflicts that are based on a significant risk, that representation will be limited by lawyers' responsibilities to another, a former client, a third person, or by a personal interest of the lawyer. And, their lawyers have some personal interests in media, in their social standing, in political interests, monetary interests, career interests, perpetuating the legal system in order to like have a place where one is important in this short lifetime that we have on this earth. How do we disclose those interests? Because I think that a lot of times, lawyers, people advertise like, well, I have this relationship with the court, or I know these things, like that's an advantage, but also creates in some ways a disadvantage when we've, bought into this social hierarchy of law, not just as like a skill that we have, but like as a profession that we're supposed to be engaged in and loyal to. How do we disclose those interests, and how do we welcome questions from clients about, well, like, who's paying you? Like, when I was a public defender, aren't you being paid by the state? Like, what is that? Like, how does that compromise you? And instead of being defensive in the face of those questions, to talk about it, to acknowledge, okay, like this is uncomfortable, and to move through it.
One minute, Sandra.
Hi. Yes. And so I think that figuring out how to do some slow learning to tolerate and reflect on discomfort in times of conflict is a skill I'm always working on, that we can work on together. And to wrap up here, I have this quote from Joy Harjo: "By listening, we will understand who we are in this holy realm of words. Remember the power of your words, just your hum, your words, your presence, your history, your struggle is powerful and deeply needed. Speaking the language of justice sometimes means we will not be recognized in the courts, which are not about justice, but about control and domination. We must remember we are speaking and reaching beyond the courts and these systems of colonial control. In closing, we have each other. Another world is possible. Write a prisoner, send a book. Remember that your words and spirit are so powerful. Free all political prisoners and prisoners of war. Free Palestine, free the land, peace to the people. Thank you.
Yes, Sandy. Oh my goodness, that was so nourishing and grounding. And thank you for emphasizing relationships and movement. Just remembering who we are outside of the realm of law, and that our advocacy must not be dictated by the confines of the law. I will see just very quickly that, Sundiata Jawanza is not able to join us, given the shifting schedule of the prison. And so he will have a statement, either written or video, to share with us. But I am so honored to introduce our next guest, Kalonji Changa. He is a seasoned organizer and activist and founder of the FTP movement. He is author of the best-selling book, How to Build a People's Army, and co-producer of the documentary, Organizing is the New Cool. Kalonji currently serves as co-chair of the Urban Survival and Preparedness Institute and is the founder of Black Power Media. Over the decades, Kalonji has done extensive work with political prisoners, including Sekou Odinga, who is now an ancestor, Doroba bin Mohad, Mumia Abu Jamal, and Leonard Peltier. His new book, Beyond Cop Cities, Dismantling State and Corporate-Funded Armies in Prisons, will be released in August. Kalonji, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Honored to be here. Wow, a lot of powerful information today. Definitely grateful to join you all. It's a fitting day, Juneteenth. We're still fighting to free the captives. I'm officially the only non-lawyer on the screen today. And in a strange way, I feel good about it because I get to speak my mind and not worry about what anyone has to say or think or feel about me. Not that any of you have to, but it just, I try to pray that I can be as free as possible. I recognize that we're at war, just like you all know that we're at war, and I'm grateful to have you all as comrades and allies in this fight. It's very necessary. You're not lawyers for the sake of being a lawyer. You're out there fighting for, our people on different levels, freedom fighters, for political prisoners, for, everyday people who become political prisoners. Excuse me. Again, knowing that we're at war, one of the things that Mao talked about was politics is war without bloodshed, while war is politics with bloodshed. The U.S. war machine has been at war or in conflict with others since its inception 248 years ago. We know there are different types of war. There's operational war, there's tactical war, there's strategic and political war. Right now, in the age of the quote unquote internet, you have instant revolutionary, instant quick grit. You can become whoever you think you want to be, and folks will follow you to the gas ovens. They will follow you to the bombing sites. They will follow you to the prison cells. And, so we look at this understanding war. We look at it and we say, okay, how do we survive America? How do we survive imperialism? How do we survive colonialism with all the atrocities that are taking place? On the eve of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, April 3rd, 1968, the day before his assassination, there was a communique that came from the San Francisco FBI field office to J. Edgar Hoover. And that particular communique stated that the Negro youth and moderates must be made to understand that if they succumb to revolutionary teachings, they would be dead revolutionaries. Immediately after World War I, Attorney General Alex Palmer organized the General Intelligence Unit with the Department of Justice and recruited 24-year-old law graduate J. Edgar Hoover. And of course, we know J. Edgar Hoover's history. We know that he had declared war not just on communists, but pretty much every effective nationalist or Pan-Africanist during the 21st century, all marginalized people, so on and so forth. Everyone from a Marcus Garvey to a King, Malcolm, the Black Panther Party, et cetera. He was, safe to say, one of the most powerful enemies that we had during this last century, and his reign of terror continues to exist. Again, I mentioned that we're at war, and of course, it's no secret. With war, one of the things that we have to keep in mind that there's a decolonization process. And with that decolonization process, we have to use extreme measures because extreme measures are used towards us. I think the first thing we have to do is understand what decolonization is. Decolonialization is a political process that refers to the undoing of colonialism, which is the exploitation and subjugation of territory, people, or resources by a foreign power. The process seeks to dismantle the structures and policies that maintain colonial rule and to restore sovereignty and autonomy to the colonized people. Decolonization often involves a range of strategies, including resistant movements, negotiations, peaceful protests, and revolutionary struggle. Along with this war on drugs, on this war on these wars that the U.S. has committed nationally and internationally, domestically, we can recall some of the wars on the Black and the poor, particularly, specifically. In '68, you had Lyndon Johnson's War on Crime, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Street Acts. You had Nixon's Law and Order, where he talked about fighting the war against the enemy within. You had Reagan, who ramped it up with the war on drugs, Clinton with the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of '94, Bush's War on Terror, all of which are expansions of a police state and mass incarceration and modern slavery. You know, we hear folks talking about Cop City. It's been the flavor of the month. Everybody's like, you know, what's going on? You know, what are we going to do? And you know, and then you move on and you see what's going on in Israel, where the Palestinians are being attacked, so on and so forth. And we recognize when we honed in on the situation, the Israelis and the U.S. have been at the forefront of both of these situations. Over here in Atlanta, where I reside and have been for the last 20 years, we know that Gilley, the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, the exchange between the students here, the police here in Atlanta and the Israeli military, has taken place over 3 decades, over 30 years. You know, they've been doing that cross training. And, you know, when we talk about things like Cop City, we look at the quote unquote Little Gaza over in Israel, where they're training mercenaries and soldiers in their version of a mock Cop City. Again, folks talk about Cop City and they think about, you know, it's the new terminology, but when you dig down into it, it's the same old stuff. It's the same old police state. So we say, how do we survive that? How do we keep on moving? When we talk about Nixon and we talk about Johnson and some of these other folks, we think back to John Ehrlichman, who was the President Nixon's domestic affairs assistant. He talked about, if you want to know what this war on drugs was really about, the Nixon campaign in '68 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. He said, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders and raid the homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. This is what continues to happen because we fail to produce our own propaganda machines. We understand that propaganda is what pretty much, you know, leads the horse. You know, they come with the scare tactics. The newspapers, they criminalize you, they demonize you, and then they gather the informants and the snitches and the turncoats the traders, and placed them inside of these activism circles, placed them inside of these encampments where you have these universities and colleges who are currently protesting and demanding some type of human right, demanding dignity, demanding that the U.S. stops backing the war on the Palestinians, or stop backing the war on the Haitians, or the wars that are going on globally. You have individuals, again, who are sprinkled within these camps. And I think that one of the things when we talk about counterinsurgency and we talk about COINTELPRO, we often look at it as a thing of the past. We look at it as a situation where, that was then, and, now everything's better, we've advanced, it's not the same anymore, so on and so forth. But then you look at a place like Atlanta, you look at Cop City, you look at these 61 people indicted. And we say, well, man, there was a lot of people out there and a lot of things going on, but some people were untouchable. Some people were unscathed. Some people weren't mentioned when it came to the indictments, but we see them everywhere. We see them plastered all over the screens, all over the community. So it's confusion. Folks ask, well, why aren't there more Black folks out there protesting Cop City? Because Black folks know many of the Africans and communities across the U.S., they're clear that there's been a war on them. So regardless of whatever type of new tactics or tools that are being used, regardless of the 20,000 plus cameras that exist here in the city of Atlanta, regardless of the armored cars, the helicopters, so on and so forth, we've never felt security. We never felt safety. We never felt like we are within a space that we weren't targets. So for many of the Black folks, many of the Africans here and at some of these other 70 different sites across the United States, they didn't feel the urge, they didn't feel the need, because, again, it's business as usual. We have to remember, again, that we can't just continue to fight on a minute level. It has to be full spectrum. The US believes in full spectrum domination. NATO believes in full spectrum domination. And we have to take it to that level. We have to say, okay, if you're attorneys, you have to be attorneys who are about war, who understand that we're at war. We can't be reactionary. We can't just say, okay, well, we're going to wait till the next political prisoner is produced. We already know the outcome. The US doesn't change its playbook. Imperialism is imperialism today, and it was imperialism yesterday. But we have to provide solutions. We have to come up with alternative means. One of the things that one of my elders, brothers, has called for over the past, really the past few years, is a united front against fascism. What is a united front against fascism? It is a principled alliance of groups against their common enemies. A united front in this context refers to various groups and individuals coming together to form a coalition or alliance. This coalition would include people from different backgrounds and political ideologies who share common goals, but with a core value of resisting fascist ideologies and reducing corporate dominance in politics. By uniting, they can amplify their voices and work towards practical solutions. This is Dhoruba bin Wahad, who called for this united front. I think that in his wisdom, he's recognized that certain things can't fly. A united front should be a natural progression for us. You have, just in Atlanta alone, hundreds of organizations. And for some of these folks, an organization might have 2 people in it or just themselves, but it's an ego-led situation. So we have a bunch of egomaniacs. We have a bunch of egomaniacs trying to fight megalomaniacs. And in the end, we're all swallowed up. We have this nonprofit industrial complex, which is redefining what revolution is. They want it to be radical. They want it to be chic. They want to, and I'm not disregarding or disrespecting anyone's tactics, but I've never been one to suffer peacefully, as Dr. King would talk about. You know, I've never been one to show up to be arrested. I don't have those type of luxuries. I'm clear about who my enemy is, and we have to be clear about who our enemies are. When we talk about decolonization, we have to talk about political education, because political education aims to raise awareness and empower individuals and communities to resist and challenge imperialism. It challenges the exploitive and oppressive nature and its negative consequences. The education provides individuals and communities with the tools, analytical skills, and strategies required for critical thinking and resistance. Again, to us, a united front is almost common sense. We are damn near going to hell in a handbasket right now. We are suffering. We're being tortured. We're being abused. And again, you know, we must stand together, continue to stand together. I definitely appreciate all of you for bringing us on board today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalonji. Really appreciate that. And you're speaking about the united front and the war that we all are in and resistance. You know, I know that there is more on your channel about the united front and have been keeping up with that myself at Black Power Media Reloaded. So thank you for that. Powerful, powerful message. I know that we're a little bit over today, but we do have one last presenter, certainly not least, my own mentor, Audrey Bomse and co-chair. Audrey Bomse has been a lawyer and member of the National Lawyers Guild since 1980 and an activist all her life. She practiced criminal law as a public defender and civil rights law, largely class actions at the New Jersey Office of Inmate Advocacy. She was legal director of the Prisoners Legal Clinic at Seton Hall Law School, which was comprised of lawyers, law students, and former prison paralegals. In 2001, during the first Intifada, she moved to the East Jerusalem and practiced international law for 7 years, including helping to organize a coalition of NGOs against torture, which was systemic in Israeli prisons and detention centers. In 2008, she joined the Free Gaza movement and sailed to Gaza to break the Israeli blockade, after which she was detained for several days and eventually deported by Israel. She was part of the land team for the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, which was attacked by Israel, killing 9 passengers and injuring hundreds more. She then helped represent some of the U.S. flotilla passengers before the International Criminal Court. She is currently co-chair of the Mass Incarceration Committee of the National Lawyers Guild. Audrey has represented political prisoners such as Sundiata Acoli and Alex Saab. It's just an honor to be here with you, Audrey, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenipher. And I want to thank you and the NCBL for organizing, you know, it's fascinating panel that I'm learning a lot from. While we're celebrating, just wanted to mention that while we're celebrating Juneteenth, especially since we're focusing on prisoners, that as we all know here, the emancipation didn't eliminate slavery for everyone, and that the 13th Amendment specifically exempts prisoners, and that there's a movement to eliminate that exception. I've been involved in the representation of only 2 political prisoners, both of them high profile and 25 years apart. I'm going to talk about the twists and turns of their cases and the frequent distortion of the law and the impact these cases had. I know that there are people on this here on the both on the panel and listening in who've had a lot more experience than I've had. And I hope that my experience will encourage new lawyers to take on these cases of political prisoners. I represented Sundiata Acoli, former Black Panther, Black Liberation Army militant, in one of his early parole hearings way back in the 90s. I guess under the distinction that Attorney Edison told us about that Sundiata made at the Brinks trial, Sundiata Acoli would be considered he was a prisoner of war. As I said, I represented him in one of his first parole hearings when he should have and would have been released if not for his politics and for the pressure from the PBA, because he'd been found guilty in a very sensationalized trial of killing a New Jersey state trooper. He'd been locked up before that as part of the New York Panther 21 conspiracy case, when he was held for 2 years without bail before being acquitted, along with all of his co-defendants. Now, despite the fact that at that point, Sundiata had almost no disciplinary infractions, he had passed multiple psychological exams, had taken more than 100 educational courses in prison, admitted his involvement in the crime and said that he regretted his actions. The New Jersey parole board kept denying him parole. Sundiata was finally ordered released. It was by the New Jersey Supreme Court. And that wasn't until 2022, way after I was involved in his case, when the state Supreme Court rejected the parole board's decision that at the age of 85, Sundiata still posed a risk to reoffend. And the court emphasized that the parole board's denial was, and just quoting, so wide off the mark and manifestly mistaken that it had to intervene in order to ensure in the interest of justice. In that case, amicus briefs were filed, and this happens not infrequently in high-profile political prisoner cases, that amicus briefs get filed. Here they were filed by the Office of the Public Defender, the NCBL, the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the American Friends Service Committee, and others. And finally, after a half century in prison and parole hearings and appeals of parole hearings, I'm at the point when he was struggling with dementia and hearing loss, Sundiata was finally allowed to come home. His case was used to show how dysfunctional the New Jersey parole system had become and why the parole board needed reform and needed to be reminded of the presumption of release that was contained in the state's Parole Act. And it shone a light on the issue that's being raised many places since of elderly prisoners, and the fact that recidivism drops drastically with age, not less than I think 1% of the people older than 65 reoffend. So there were issues that were raised that were broader than just pertaining to political prisoners. Since the title of this program is Revolution as an Act of Love, I just wanted to point out that how much Sundiata loved his community in prison when he wasn't in solitary. which was a lot for many, many years, including at Trenton State Prison and the infamous Marion, a federal prison, although he had no federal charges or sentence. In prison, he mentored literally hundreds of younger prisoners, and he remained in touch as much as possible with his community. When he knew that I was going to Cuba, he asked me to personally convey his love and solidarity to his co-defendant, Assata Shakur, which I did. I was honored to meet her. And folks loved Sundiata back. They supported him throughout all of his trials, parole hearings, appeals, and set up a significant fund to help his family support him when he finally came home. The second case that I worked on, which was just recently, was that of Alex Saab, who was a Venezuelan diplomat who was kidnapped in Cape Verde on the orders of the US during a refueling stopover on his way to Iran to negotiate food and fuel imports in order to circumvent the US sanctions, which were devastating the country. Yet I say kidnapped because he was arrested without a warrant, without an Interpol at this point, since it was international, without an Interpol red notice, and was extradited to the US without an extradition treaty. And only after he'd been tortured for over a year in what he told me was like what they did in Guantanamo. And he had difficulty holding back tears when he talked about the torture. All of this was basically because he was key to helping Venezuela avoid the US sanctions. He was charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering, and his main defense was that he was a diplomat. And since he was a diplomat, the US was bound by the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations to recognize his diplomatic status and give him immunity from prosecution. And just to show how the US criminal justice system can be twisted in cases of political prisoners, the federal judge in Miami on Alex's motion to dismiss based on his diplomatic status ruled that even if Saab was a diplomat, since the US didn't recognize the legitimacy of the Maduro government in Venezuela, the court wasn't bound to recognize the legitimacy of any of Maduro's diplomats. Imagine that this was a really dangerous precedent and could upend international diplomacy if any country could arrest the diplomats of another country just because they didn't recognize the legitimacy of the government. That would include, Iran, North Korea, whatever. Again, seeing representing revolutionaries and revolutionaries themselves as acts of love. Alex loved and sacrificed for the Venezuelan people, although he wasn't even he's not Venezuelan, he's from Colombia. He had been told, both in Cape Verde, Africa, by his English-speaking interrogators or torturers, and then again in the US, that all he needed to do to get out was to point the finger at President Maduro, which he refused to do. Alex, oh, let me just mention also that Alex cared not only about the people of Venezuela, but also about the Palestinian people. And he wanted, when he knew that I had been working in Palestine, he wanted to talk with me often about both their suffering and their resistance. The only way that Alex was released was through a government-to-government prisoner swap. He would no doubt have been found guilty of whatever charges the government was charging him with. There had been huge rallies in Venezuela throughout his captivity, demanding his release, and even larger rallies to welcome him home. And I'm hoping to see him as a free man soon in Caracas. It's hard to put into words how really privileged I felt getting to know both of these remarkable, principled, and loving men who are totally committed to their people. And I'm sure that others on this panel have felt the same about their representation of many of the clients who are political. It was heartbreaking at times to see how the justice system tried so hard to break them. But it was wonderful seeing all the support that they had, and it was really exhilarating to see them come home. And as I said, I for the new attorneys who are on this call, I urge them to take on cases like this. They are so you learn so much more, and you feel the love from them and from their people. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, for sharing the machinations of the state with respect to political prisoners, and for encouraging new lawyers, as I once was myself when I first met you, for taking on these kinds of cases. Now, I realize that we're over time, and folks may have questions, and I want to respect our participants' time, and as well as our panelists' time. So maybe we can take one question, and then if you all have other questions to submit, you can send them by email. Let's see, you can send them to me at Jenipher J, Jenipher J at forthepeoplelegal.com, and we'll make sure that your question or your comment gets to the respective panelists. So if there is a question that we have, I don't see any right now, but I certainly want to keep my promise and at least open up to one question. Okay, I see J.A. Rizzi Reynolds. If you can come off mute, who has raised their hand. There we go.
Hey,
Okay.
sorry for the delay. I didn't see the unmute. I actually typed it already in the Q&A earlier in the conversation. Just how do you balance the need to earn a living with the need to pursue justice?
Your question was a little bit muffled, Mr. Reynolds. How do you balance?
All right, is that better?
Yes, that's better.
All right, sorry about that. Yeah, I typed it in the Q&A section earlier, but basically, how do you make a living while pursuing justice? And I know, some clients are able to pay, or their support network. But is that always how it works? I don't really know that much about that side.
I think I don't know if several of our panelists who may want to answer this question about how to make money while you are pursuing justice. I know with civil, prisoner cases that the Prison Litigation Act, categorically discourages the participation of lawyers by limiting the recovery. But I know some of our panelists may have some insight about particular programs in the courts, whether it be pro bono programs or other like ADC programs, alternative defense counsel, like that we have here in the state of Colorado, that may be available to folks. So I don't know if our panelists have any comments on how to make a living, like how to live.
Hi, this is Habekah. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm not able to share my screen. I did have to change locations, but to answer that question, and I'd like to speak to young attorneys about this, because you're coming out of law school, thinking about student loans, personal self-perseverance, how do I make a living doing what I love and taking some of what others may feel as these riskier cases. And my answer to that is what I also use in my presentation, going back, leaning on the community. A lot of times, in these movement spaces, your client will have a support system, and you'll be surprised where or who would be willing to fund their defense and to make sure that they have a proper defense that's client-centered. So I'd say, go for it. But also then don't forget that's another part where community comes into play. They'll raise money for attorneys and legal fees, and also just things that need to be done within the case to make sure that everyone gets a fair, just defense.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? I was working at the New Jersey Office of the Public Defender when Sundiata came up for parole. And I had to fight to take the case, but eventually the state ended up paying for it. So it is possible if you're in state-paid, state-funded organizations to take on some of these cases.
Audrey, and I see Mo has their hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't make a ton of money, but I do keep body and soul together by subsidizing my pro bono practice with doing wills and agency documents and, helping people do second parent adoptions, which, it's not big lawyer money, but it's enough. It's enough.
Thank you. Also, employment law in my own practice helps to subsidize a lot of the work as well. I do that also. So today was such a rich discussion. I know a long one too, but I think apropos. And it'll be recorded and available to everyone. I cannot thank the panelists and the participants enough. I saw many panelists or participants who could be panelists themselves, and maybe the length of this program indicates a need to keep an ongoing conversation going. But in any event, I wish all of you a happy Juneteenth and peace and power and love. Have a wonderful afternoon. Take care. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jenipher.
Thank you, Jenipher. Stay safe, sisters.